Hey everyone, welcome back to the deadliest channel. Before we dive into today's story, I need you to do me a favor. Subscribe and like my channel, and grab a cup of coffee. Get comfortable, because what I am about to tell you is going to stay with you long after this video ends. This is the story of Francys Arsentiev, known on Mount Everest as Sleeping Beauty. And I promise you, this isn't just another climbing tragedy. This is a story about ambition, love, death, and the thin line between heroism and madness. So, let's get into it. You know, when most people think about Mount Everest, they picture that iconic summit shot, right? The climber standing on top of the world, arms raised in victory, prayer flags whipping in the wind. But what they don't show you in those pictures is the cost. They don't show you the bodies. And there are bodies up there, frozen in time, preserved by the brutal cold, serving as grim reminders to every climber who passes by that Everest doesn't forgive mistakes. Among those bodies there was one that haunted climbers for years, a woman in a purple jacket, lying on her side as if she were just sleeping. They called her Sleeping Beauty, but her real name was Francys Arsentiev, and her story is one of the most heartbreaking and terrifying tales in mountaineering history. The woman behind the legend, Francys Arsentiev's early life. Let me take you back to the beginning, to who Francys was before she became a legend on the mountain. Francys de Stefano Arsentiev was born in 1958 in Honolulu, Hawaii. She wasn't born into mountaineering. She discovered it later in life, and when she did, it consumed her. She was a successful businesswoman, educated, accomplished, living the American dream in many ways. But there was something about the mountains that called to her soul. Maybe it was the challenge, maybe it was the beauty, or maybe it was the way the mountains made her feel alive in a way that nothing else could. Francys wasn't some reckless thrill-seeker. She was methodical, intelligent, someone who approached climbing with the same dedication she brought to her business ventures. She trained extensively, studied the mountains, learned the technical skills required for high-altitude climbing. This wasn't a hobby for her. It was a passion that burned inside her, something that gave her life meaning beyond the everyday routine of work and responsibilities. And then she met Sergei Arsentiev, a Russian mountaineer with an impressive climbing resume. Sergei was experienced, strong, and shared Francys's deep love for the mountains. When they met, it wasn't just romance, it was recognition. They saw in each other kindred spirits, people who understood that pull toward the high places of the world, that need to test yourself against the impossible. They fell deeply in love, got married, and together they started climbing bigger and bigger peaks. They weren't just husband and wife, they were climbing partners, dream partners, bound together by their shared obsession with the mountains. They had a son, Paul, and for a while, life seemed perfect. They had a family, they had their passion, they had each other. But as any climber will tell you, once the mountains get into your blood, they never really let go. And for Francys and Sergei, there was one mountain that called louder than all the others. Mount Everest, the highest point on Earth, the ultimate challenge for any mountaineer. The audacious plan, climbing without oxygen now. Here's where their story takes a unique and fateful turn. Francys and Sergei weren't just going to climb Everest. They were going to do it without supplemental oxygen. Let me explain why that matters, because this decision would ultimately determine their fate. You see, most climbers who attempt Everest use bottled oxygen because above 8,000 meters, about 26,000 feet, you're in what mountaineers call the death zone. And that name isn't dramatic, it's literal. Your body is dying up there. At that altitude, the air pressure is so low that your lungs can't extract enough oxygen from each breath to sustain your body's functions. Your cells start to deteriorate. Your brain begins to swell. Fluid accumulates in your lungs. Your blood thickens. Every minute you spend in the death zone, your body is shutting down bit by bit. Supplemental oxygen doesn't solve the problem completely, but it helps. It gives your body a fighting chance. It's the difference between struggling and suffocating. But Francys had a dream that went beyond just summiting Everest. She wanted to be the first American woman to reach the summit of Mount Everest without using supplemental oxygen. She wanted to prove that the human body, the human will, the human spirit, could conquer the mountain on its own terms, without technological assistance. It was an incredibly ambitious goal. Some would say it was bordering on hubris. But that's what drove Francys. She didn't want to just reach the summit. She wanted to do it the hard way, the pure way, the way that would cement her place in mountaineering history. Sergei supported her dream completely. He would climb without oxygen. They would do this together, as they did everything else. They spent months preparing, training their bodies to function with less oxygen, studying the routes, timing their attempt perfectly. They knew it was dangerous. They knew that climbing without oxygen dramatically increased their risks. But they also believed in themselves, in their training, in their partnership. They thought they could beat the odds, and in 1998, they were ready to try. The Journey to the Roof of the World, 1998 expedition in the spring of 1998. Francys and Sergei traveled to Nepal to join an Everest expedition. The journey to Everest isn't something you can do in a day. First, you fly into Kathmandu, then take a small plane to Lukla, one of the world's most dangerous airports, perched on the side of a mountain with a runway that ends in a cliff. From there, it's a 2-week trek through the Himalayas just to reach base camp at 17,600 feet. The trek itself is beautiful, passing through Sherpa villages, Buddhist monasteries, suspension bridges over raging rivers, with Everest growing larger on the horizon with each day. Base camp is where the real preparation begins. You can't just arrive at Everest and start climbing to the summit. Your body needs time to acclimatize to the altitude. Climbers spend weeks at base camp, making progressively higher climbs to various camps up the mountain, then returning to base camp to rest and recover. It's called the rotation system. You might climb to Camp 1 at 20,000 feet, stay overnight, then descend. A few days later, you push to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet, then eventually Camp 3 at 24,000 feet. Each time, your body adapts a little more to the thin air, producing more red blood cells, learning to function with less oxygen. It's a slow, grueling process that takes weeks. Francys and Sergei were part of an expedition, but they were climbing independently, which means they weren't tied to the group's schedule or safety protocols. They had their own plan, their own timeline. This gave them flexibility, but it also meant they were more isolated, more on their own if something went wrong. They went through the acclimatization rotations, tested their bodies at high altitude, and waited for the weather to be right. Everest has a very narrow window each year, when the weather is stable enough to attempt the summit, usually in May. Before and after that window, the jet stream winds that normally batter the summit shift away, creating a brief period of relative calm. That's when you have to make your move. In mid-May 1998, the weather looked good. Francys and Sergei made their decision. They would go for the summit. On May 22nd, they began their final push from Camp 4, the highest camp, located at about 26,000 feet in the death zone. This is where you start the summit bid, usually leaving in the late evening or early morning hours to reach the summit at dawn and have enough daylight to get back down. The climb from Camp 4 to the summit is only about 3,000 vertical feet, but at that altitude, every step feels like you're walking through concrete. Your lungs burn, your legs are like lead, your brain is foggy from lack of oxygen. The summit. May 23rd, 1998. A dream. Achieved. Francys and Sergei climbed through the night of May 22nd. Imagine that scene for a moment. Darkness all around them, the beam of their headlamps cutting through the black, the wind howling, the temperature somewhere around minus 30 or 40 degrees Celsius. They climbed slowly, methodically, stopping frequently to catch their breath, which was even harder without supplemental oxygen. Every climber who has been in the death zone describes the same thing. The overwhelming desire to just sit down and rest, to close your eyes for just a minute. But you can't. If you stop moving, you die. So they kept putting one foot in front of the other, kept pushing upward. The route took them past all the famous landmarks of Everest's final stretch. The balcony, a flat area where climbers rest before the final push. The South Summit, a false summit that cruelly makes you think you're almost there when you still have 2 hours of climbing left. The Hillary Step, a nearly vertical rock face that was one of the final technical challenges before the true summit. And with each landmark passed, they knew they were getting closer. As the sun rose on May 23rd, 1998, Francys and Sergei Arsentiev stood on the summit of Mount Everest. They had done it at 29,029 feet above sea level. They stood on the highest point on Earth. Francys had achieved her dream. She was the first American woman to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen. The view from the top is supposed to be incredible. You can see for hundreds of miles in every direction. The curvature of the Earth visible, other Himalayan giants like K2 and Makalu visible in the distance. But most climbers say they're so exhausted at the summit that they barely register the view. They take a few photos, maybe plant a flag or say a prayer, and then they start down. Because as any experienced mountaineer will tell you, the summit is only halfway. You still have to get down. Most deaths on Everest happen on the descent. You've used up all your energy getting to the top. Your body is running on fumes. Your oxygen-deprived brain isn't making good decisions. And you still have hours of dangerous climbing ahead of you. But in that moment on the summit, Francys and Sergei must have felt invincible. They had done what they set out to do. They had proven their strength, their determination, their ability to function where the human body isn't meant to survive. They had climbed Everest without oxygen and made it to the top. They were living proof that it could be done. But the mountain wasn't finished with them yet. Not even close. The descent into nightmare. Getting separated, Francys and Sergei started their descent from the summit sometime in the late morning of May 23rd. The exact details of what happened next are unclear because no one was with them. But at some point during that descent, they became separated. How it happened, no one knows for sure. Maybe Sergei moved faster, descending ahead of Francys. Maybe Francys needed to rest and told Sergei to go ahead. Maybe visibility got bad and they lost sight of each other in the clouds or blowing snow. Maybe it was a combination of factors, exhaustion and confusion and the slight differences in their pace, adding up to a fatal separation. What we do know is that by the time they should have been back at Camp 4, only Sergei arrived. And when he realized Francys wasn't there, wasn't anywhere in sight, the nightmare truly began. In the world of high-altitude mountaineering, getting separated from your climbing partner in the death zone is one of the worst things that can happen. You're in an environment where you can barely help yourself, where communication is difficult, where finding someone in the vastness of the mountain is nearly impossible. Francys, wherever she was on that mountain, was in serious trouble. She was suffering from what climbers call summit fever exhaustion, that complete depletion of energy that comes from pushing your body beyond its limits. Without supplemental oxygen, her body had been deteriorating faster than it would have otherwise. She was also suffering from severe frostbite, the cold having damaged the tissue in her fingers, toes, and face. At some point, she simply couldn't go any further. She collapsed somewhere around 8,600 meters, about 28,200 feet, just below the summit area, still deep in the death zone. And there she lay, Unabli Tumuba, unable to descend, unable to call for help effectively. She was alone on the highest mountain in the world, with night falling and the temperature about to plummet even further. The longest night. Francys alone in the death zone now. I want you to try to imagine this for a moment. Really imagine it. You're lying on the side of a mountain. Unable. Tomoble. Your body is so exhausted that you can't even sit up. You're at an altitude where every breath feels like you're suffocating. The sun is going down, and you know that when darkness comes, the temperature is going to drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius or lower. You're already dangerously cold, already losing feeling in your extremities. And there's no one coming. No rescue helicopter can fly at that altitude. No team of rescuers can reach you quickly. You're completely, utterly alone. That's what Francys experienced on the night of May 23rd into May 24th, 1998. She spent that entire night exposed on the mountain, lying in the snow and ice, with nothing to protect her from the cold, from the wind, from the darkness. She should have died. By all accounts, by everything we know about human physiology and hypothermia, she should have frozen to death during those hours. Most people who are caught out overnight in the death zone don't survive. The combination of cold, altitude, and exhaustion is simply too much for the human body to endure. But somehow, impossibly, incredibly, Francys survived until morning. Her body shut down non-essential functions. Her metabolism slowed to a crawl. Her heart rate dropped. She was in a kind of suspended animation, hovering between life and death, her body fighting with every fiber to stay alive just a little bit longer. Maybe she was thinking about her son, Paul, about her husband, Sergei, about wanting to see them again. Maybe that thought, That desperate need to survive was what kept her alive through those dark hours. Or maybe it was just biology. The body's incredible ability to endure beyond what should be possible. When the sun rose on May 24th, Francys was still alive. Barely, but alive. Her body was severely hypothermic. Her face and hands were purple from frostbite. She was drifting in and out of consciousness. But her heart was still beating. She was still breathing. And she was about to have an encounter that would become one of the most haunting moments in Everest history. Don't leave me. The encounter with other climbers. On May 24th, a group of climbers from Uzbekistan were making their summit attempt. This included climbers like Ian Woodall and Kathy O'Dowd, among others who were on the mountain that day. As they were ascending toward the summit, they came across something that stopped them in their tracks. There, lying on the slope, was Francys Arsentiev. They found her alive. When they first saw her, they couldn't believe someone had survived a night out in the open at that altitude. She was lying on her side, her purple jacket torn and dirty, her face a disturbing color from the frostbite, ice crystals in her hair and on her skin, but as they got closer, she moved. Her eyes opened. She looked at them. And she spoke. Her voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but the words were clear. She said, "Don't leave me." Just 3 words, but they carried the weight of absolute desperation. "Don't leave me." She repeated it again. "Please don't leave me." The climbers stopped, shocked, horrified, facing an impossible situation. Here was a woman, still alive, begging them for help. But they were at 8,600 meters in the death zone, barely able to help themselves, let alone carry someone down the mountain. Francys was far too weak to walk. She couldn't move her legs, couldn't sit up without help. To carry her down would require multiple people, would take hours, would use up everyone's oxygen and energy. And even if they tried, the chances of success were almost zero. People have tried to rescue stranded climbers on Everest before, and those attempts have often resulted in the deaths of the rescuers as well as the person they were trying to save. In the death zone, the cruel mathematics of survival are simple. You can barely save yourself. You almost certainly can't save someone else. But she was right there in front of them, looking at them with desperate eyes, speaking to them. Ian Woodall later said that Francys kept repeating those words over and over. "Do you and leave me. Please, don't leave me. Don't let me die here." Can you imagine being in that position? Looking into someone's eyes as they beg you to save them, knowing that you probably can't, knowing that if you try, you might die too. The climbers did what they could. They gave her oxygen from their own bottles, even though their supply was limited. They tried to warm her up, rubbing her hands and feet, covering her with their spare clothing. They radioed down to base camp, explained the situation, asked for advice, but the answer that came back was the same cruel reality they already knew. There was nothing that could be done. No rescue was possible at that altitude. The only thing that might save her was if she could somehow muster the strength to descend on her own. But looking at her condition, everyone knew that wasn't going to happen. The impossible decision. Leaving her behind after spending precious time with Francys, using up their own oxygen, feeling their own bodies starting to deteriorate from prolonged exposure in the death zone. The climbers had to make a decision. If they stayed much longer, they would be putting their own lives in jeopardy. Their oxygen was running low, their bodies were weakening, and they still had to reach the summit and get back down themselves. It was a decision that no one should ever have to make. But in the death zone, these are the kinds of choices that climbers face. They decided to continue their climb to the summit. Their thinking, their hope, was that if they could reach the summit quickly and start their descent, maybe they could get back to Francys with more oxygen. Maybe they could organize something. Maybe the situation would somehow improve. It was a thin hope, probably more of a rationalization than a real plan. But it was all they had. They told Francys they would come back. They told her to hold on. And then they left her there, still alive, still conscious, still waiting for the help that would never come. I can't imagine what that must have been like for Francys, watching them walk away, seeing her last hope disappearing up the mountain. But I also can't imagine what it was like for those climbers, having to make that choice, having to walk away from someone who was begging them not to. Ian Woodall has spoken about it many times over the years, about the incredible guilt he felt, about the nightmares he had afterward. He never forgot her words, "Don't leave me." They echoed in his mind for years. The final words, "I'm an American," later that day. As the climbers were descending from the summit, they came across Francys. Again, she was still there, still in the same spot, still alive. BD's point, she had been lying exposed on the mountain for well over 24 hours, possibly closer to 36 hours. The fact that she was still breathing was almost beyond comprehension, but something had changed. She was no longer begging them to stay. She was no longer asking for help in the same desperate way. This time, when she saw the climbers, she looked at them and said something that would become her final recorded words. The last thing she would ever say to another human being. She whispered, her voice even weaker than before. "I'm an American. Please don't leave me." Why she said those specific words, we'll never know. Maybe in her deteriorating mental state, she thought that identifying her nationality might somehow make a difference, might trigger some kind of official rescue. Maybe she was thinking about her country, her home, the place she wanted to return to. Maybe it was just confusion, her brain shutting down, grasping at random thoughts. But those words, "I'm an American, please don't leave me," became the last testament of Francys Arsentiev. The climbers could do nothing but watch. They had no more oxygen to give her. They were exhausted themselves. They were fighting their own battle to survive. And as they stood there, unable to hell, unable to leave, unable to look away, Francys Arsentiev took her final breaths. Her chest rose and fell one last time. Her eyes closed, and she was gone. She died right there in front of them, at 8,600 meters on Mount Everest, becoming one of the many who would never leave the mountain. The climbers marked the spot, noted the location, and continued their descent. There was nothing else they could do. They had witnessed the woman's final moments, had heard her final words, and now all they could do was get themselves to safety and report what had happened. They had tried to help. They had given her what little they could, but in the end, the mountain had won. Sergei's desperate rescue attempt, but here's where the story takes an even darker, even more heartbreaking turn. Remember Sergei, Francys's husband, the man who had summited Everest with her just a day before. When Sergei reached Camp 4 and then eventually Base Camp, and realized that Francys hadn't made it down, he wasn't going to just accept it. He wasn't going to sit there and wait for news. He didn't care what anyone told him about the impossibility of a rescue. He was going to find his wife, without adequate rest, without proper preparation, without even full equipment. Sergei started back up the mountain. Alone. Think about that for a second. He had just climbed to the summit of Everest without oxygen, descended to camp, and now, with his body already devastated by the effort, he was turning around and climbing back into the death zone. Other climbers at the camp saw him preparing to go back up. They tried to stop him. They tried to tell him it was suicide. They explained that he was in no condition to make another attempt, that he would die if he tried. But Sergei wouldn't listen. He couldn't listen. The woman he loved was up there somewhere, and he was going to find her. So, Ikline. Back up into the thin air, back into the death zone, retracing his steps from the previous day, calling out for Francys. Looking for any sign of her, he was operating on nothing but love and desperation. His body must have been screaming at him to stop, to go bake down, but he kept pushing upward. Other climbers who were descending that day reported seeing him going up, moving slowly but with determination, a lone figure climbing back into hell. And he found her. We know this because when Sergei's body was discovered a year later in 1999, it was found at around 8,200 meters, about 27,000 feet, with climbing equipment scattered around him. There was a rope. There were carabiners. There was everything you would need to lower someone down the mountain. The evidence strongly suggests that Sergei found Francys, possibly while she was still alive, and attempted to rescue her. Imagine that scene. Sergei, already exhausted beyond measure, finding his wife lying on the mountain. Did he reach her before she died? Did they have a final moment together? Or did he arrive to find her already gone? We'll never know. What we do know is that he tried to save her. He was setting up a system to lower her down the mountain, to bring her home. But in his exhausted state, already pushed far beyond human limits, something went wrong. The tragic end. Sergei's fall. The exact circumstances of Sergei's death aren't completely clear, but the physical evidence tells a grim story. His body was found with injuries, consistent with a fall. His equipment was tangled around him. The most likely scenario, reconstructed from what was found, is that while trying to set up the rope system to lower, exhausted and oxygen deprived, Sergei either slipped or made a mistake with his equipment. He fell several hundred meters down the mountain. The fall would have been fatal. At those altitudes, with the rocks and ice, a fall of that distance means certain death. Sergei Arsentiev died on Mount Everest, trying to rescue the woman he loved. He died being a hero. He died refusing to give up. He died proving that love can push us beyond what should be possible, even if it ultimately costs us everything. So now we have this unimaginably tragic scene on Mount Everest. Francys lying dead on the slope at 8,600 meters, her purple jacket visible against the white snow. And Sergei, several hundred meters below, his body broken from the fall, his rescue equipment still attached to him. Both of them dead. Both of them claimed by the mountain within 24 hours of achieving their dream of summiting together. Their son, Paul, back home in the United States, had just become an orphan. He had lost both of his parents to the same mountain, to the same expedition. Two people who had loved each other so much, who had shared such an incredible passion, who had achieved something extraordinary together, were now frozen on Everest forever, becoming Sleeping Beauty. 9 years as a landmark in death, Francys Arsentiev became something she never wanted to be. A landmark. For the next 9 years, from 1998 to 2007, her body remained exactly where she died, frozen in place at 8,600 meters on the north face of Everest. The extreme cold and low bacteria levels at that altitude meant her body didn't decompose. It was preserved almost perfectly, frozen in time, a gruesome memorial to the dangers of the mountain, becoming Sleeping Beauty. 9 years as a landmark in death. Francys Arsentiev became something she never wanted to be. A landmark. For the next 9 years, from 1998 to 2007, her body remained exactly where she died, frozen in place at 8,600 meters on the north face of Everest. The extreme cold and low bacteria levels at that altitude meant her body didn't decompose. It was preserved almost perfectly, frozen in time, a gruesome memorial to the dangers of the mountain. Every climber who attempted Everest via the north-faced route during those 9 years would pass by Francys' body. She was impossible to miss. That purple jacket stood out starkly against the white and gray of the mountain. She was lying on her side, and from a distance, she really did look like she was just sleeping, curled up as if taking a nap. That's how she got the nickname Sleeping Beauty. Climbers started using her as a navigational reference point. "Oh, you're getting close to the summit when you pass Sleeping Beauty." I saw Sleeping Beauty today, so I knew I was on the right route. But the climbers who got close enough to see her face told a different story. Her face was contorted, not peaceful at all, but showing the pain and fear of her final moments. Her skin was discolored from frostbite, a deep purple-black color that made her look almost inhuman. She didn't look like she was sleeping. She looked like she had died in agony, which she had. The nickname Sleeping Beauty was almost cruel in its irony, a soft name for something that was actually horrifying to see. Some climbers would stop and say a prayer when they passed her. Some would leave small tokens, a photo, a flag, a religious item, trying to show respect. But most just hurried past, not wanting to look too closely, not wanting to think too much about the fact that they were stepping over a dead woman on their way to the summit. It was a grim reminder of what could happen, but it was also normalized. That's just what Everest is. It's a mountain with bodies on it. You accept that as part of the deal. But one person couldn't accept it. One person couldn't walk away from Francys Arsentiev and forget about her. Ian Woodall, one of the climbers who had found her alive, who had heard her final words, who had to leave her there to die, was haunted by her. He couldn't sleep. He had nightmares. He kept seeing her face, kept hearing her voice. "Don't leave me." For 9 years. Im. And finally, in 2007, he decided he had to do something about it. Ian Woodall's return, giving Sleeping Beauty dignity 2007 and 2007. Nearly a decade after Francys's death, Ian Woodall organized an expedition to Everest with a very specific goal. He wasn't going for the summit. He wasn't trying to set any records. He was going back to give Sleeping Beauty some dignity in death. He was going to move her body away from the climbing route, to give her some peace. To make it so that she wasn't just a landmark for passing climbers to gawk at anymore. This was no small undertaking. At 8,600 meters, in the death zone, any physical activity is incredibly difficult and dangerous. Moving a frozen body, even a short distance, requires enormous effort and puts everyone involved at serious risk. But Ian felt he owed it to Francys. He felt he owed it to himself to find some peace with what had happened on that mountain 9 years before. Ian and his team climbed to where Francys's body lay. When they reached her, she was exactly as she had been for 9 years, perfectly preserved by the cold. She was still in that same position, still wearing the purple jacket that had made her famous. Ian later said that seeing her again brought all the emotions flooding back, all the guilt, all the horror of that day when he had to leave her to die. With great difficulty, working slowly in the thin air, Ian and his team wrapped Francys's body in an American flag. It seemed like the right thing to do, honoring her nationality, the thing she had mentioned in her final words. Then, using ropes and all their strength, they carefully moved her body away from the main climbing route. They couldn't bring her down the mountain. Moving a body thousands of meters down through the most dangerous terrain on Earth was simply impossible. But they did something perhaps even more respectful. They found a more secluded spot, a more peaceful location away from the trail where climbers wouldn't constantly be walking past her. Carefully, reverently, they lowered her body over a cliff face into a crevasse and covered her with rocks and snow. They performed a small ceremony, said some words, offered a prayer. Ian said his own private goodbye, finally making peace with the choice he had to make 9 years before. And then they left her there, in her final resting place, no longer a spectacle, no longer a landmark, finally allowed to rest in something resembling peace. The meaning of it all. Lessons from the mountain. So what does this story mean? Why does Francys Arsentiev's tragedy matter nearly 3 decades later? I think it matters because it forces us to confront some really difficult questions about ambition, about risk, about the price we're willing to pay for our dreams. Francys and Sergei knew the risks. They weren't naive or unprepared. They were experienced climbers who understood that climbing Everest without oxygen dramatically increased their chances of dying. They made an informed choice, accepted that risk, and went ahead anyway. They did it because Francys wanted to be the first American woman to summit without oxygen. She wanted that achievement, that recognition, that proof that she was capable of something extraordinary. And she got it. She made it to the summit. She achieved her dream, but she paid for it with her life. Was it worth it? That's a question only she could answer, and she's not here to tell us. What haunts me about this story is how close they came to making it. If they had turned around just a little bit earlier, if they had stayed together during the descent, if any number of small things had gone differently, they both would have survived. They would have come home. Francys would have had her record. They would have celebrated together. Sergei would have watched his son grow up. But that's not what happened. The mountain doesn't care about almost. It doesn't give partial credit. You either make it or you don't. Sergei's part of the story is what really breaks my heart. He summited Everest. He achieved the goal. He could have stayed safe at camp or descended to base camp. But when he realized Francys was missing, he didn't hesitate. He went back up into the death zone, knowing it was probably a death sentence, because leaving her up there wasn't an option he could live with. That's love. That's also the kind of decision that shows how our emotions, our attachments, our inability to let go can override every survival instinct we have. He died trying to save her. He died being heroic. He died refusing to give up on the person he loved most. And their son, Paul, lost both parents in the same expedition. The moral questions raised by Francys's death are complicated. When the other climbers found her alive and had to decide whether to help her or continue their own climb, what should they have done? Was it morally acceptable to leave a dying woman on the mountain? Or were they justified in prioritizing their own survival? I honestly don't know the answer. I think Ian Woodall struggled with that question for 9 years before he went back to move her body. I think he needed to prove to himself that he had done everything he possibly could, even if it was 9 years too late. What I do know is that Everest has a way of stripping away all the comfortable moral certainties we live with in normal life, at sea level. In normal conditions, leaving someone who's begging for help would be unconscionable. But at 8,600 meters, in the death zone, with your own oxygen running low and your body shutting down, the rules change. The mountain doesn't care about your ethics. It doesn't care about your guilt. It only cares about one thing. Can you survive? And sometimes, surviving means making choices you'll have to live with for the rest of your life. Francys Arsentiev was more than Sleeping Beauty. She was a daughter, a wife, a mother, a businesswoman, an athlete. She had a full life before Everest. She had accomplishments beyond that mountain. But the mountain has a way of defining people. When you die up there, that becomes who you are. You become your death. And for 9 years, Francys was just a body in a purple jacket that climbers used as a landmark. That's deeply unfair. She deserved better than that. Ian Woodall's mission in 2007 gave her some of that dignity back, but it couldn't change the fundamental tragedy of her story. The lesson, if there is one, is about the price of ambition. Francys wanted something so badly that she was willing to risk everything for. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing different perspectives on these complex stories. This is the kind of story that makes us think about what really matters in life. About ambition, about love, about sacrifice. So, let's have a real conversation about it. And listen, if you've made it all the way to the end of this video, if you've spent the last 2 hours with me diving deep into this tragic story, I have a favor to ask. Please hit that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more people, and stories like this deserve to be heard. They're not just entertainment. They're lessons. They're reminders. They're tributes to people who lived and died pursuing something they believed in. And if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please do that too. Click that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we create content like this regularly. We dive deep into the extreme edges of human experience. The stories that challenge us, that make us think, that show us what humans are capable of. Both the inspiring and the terrifying. We don't just scratch the surface. We go deep. We tell the full story. And we treat these real people and their experiences with the respect they deserve. Share this video with someone you think would appreciate it. Share it with your friends who love mountaineering stories, who are interested in human psychology, who wonder what drives people to risk everything for a dream. This is a story that deserves to be shared, that deserves to be remembered. In the comments, just type "Rest in Peace, Francys and Sergei," if this story touched you. Let's fill the comment section with tributes to them, with recognition that they were real people with real families. Not just a tragic story, but human beings who loved and dreamed and fought to survive. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for caring about this story. Thank you for being part of this community where we explore the incredible, the tragic, and the inspiring together. Until next time, stay safe, cherish the people you love, and remember that life is precious. Not every mountain needs to be climbed. Not every risk needs to be taken. Sometimes, coming home is the greatest achievement of all. I'll see you in the next video. Take care of yourselves.